In June 2017, I participated in the Healing and Reconciliation Tour sponsored by the Presbyterian Church in Canada. This is an abbreviated presentation that I gave following the tour. Marion Mitchell Morrison, known professionally as John Wayne, was nicknamed the Duke. He was an American actor and filmmaker. Wayne's career took off in 1939 with John Ford's Stagecoach, making him an instant star. He went on to star in 142 movies. John Wayne personified for millions of people the frontier heritage. 83 of his movies were westerns, and in them he played cowboys, cavalrymen, and unconquerable loners. You might remember him from the movie Red River, or The Searchers, or True Grit. Now you're probably thinking, what does John Wayne have to do with anything? Excellent question. In all of my years of attending grade school and university, I learned nothing about Indigenous people in general, or the residential school system in particular. I grew up in Toronto and had friends from all over the world, but the experience of Indigenous people in Canada was completely foreign to me. And so most everything I knew about Indigenous people, I learned from Western movies. The plot of these movies were fairly predictable. Cowboys, settlers, a solitary hero making his way west, perhaps a beautiful but helpless woman along the way who needs rescuing. The Indigenous people, when they do show up, are always a menace, an impediment to all that is good in the world. The enemy. Cue the ominous music, the pounding drums, the natives come whooping and hollering onto the scene. The ending of these movies was also equally predictable. The solitary hero, the settlers, the beautiful but helpless woman in distress come out on top, whereas the natives find themselves on the kicking end of things. They go down in defeat. Score one for the Duke. Sadly, that was my education, and just the way things were in the world, and I never thought to question it. But of course, we're talking about American history or myth here. John Wayne was an American. What we really need is a Canadian hero. Sir John Alexander Macdonald was the first Prime Minister of Canada, the dominant figure of Canadian Confederation. He had a political career which spanned almost half a century. Many consider Macdonald the architect of the Indian Act of 1876. The Indian Act was a set of policies that outlined how the government of Canada would deal with Indigenous peoples in Canada. It was sometimes referred to as the Indian problem. In the 19th century, we have all these Europeans coming to Canada. We need land. There are people already here with their strange culture and customs. What do we do? Well, Canada is a big country, so we can confine these strange people to property we do not need or want, at least at this point, place them on reserves. But that isn't a permanent solution. And so John A. Macdonald and a lot of other people began to think that the solution to the Indian problem was to make them like us, assimilation, or gradual civilization. Make them like us, and then we don't have to worry about their strange customs and cultures. And one of the best ways to do that was to take the children away from their parents and enroll them in schools and teach them to be like white Europeans in every respect. This is what John A. MacDonald said in 1879. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training's mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself, as head of the department, that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. It was around 1880 that the first residential school for Native children were created. And in case you think this is ancient history, the last school was closed in 1996. These schools were a partnership between government and church. The government built and funded the schools. The churches provided the staff, the teachers, the principals, the managers. Duncan Campbell Scott was a Canadian lifetime civil servant who served as the Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932. The Canadian government's Indian policy had already been set before Scott was in a position to influence it, but he never saw any reason to question its assumption that the red man ought to become just like the white man. Scott wrote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." In 1920, under Scott's direction, an amendment to the Indian Act made it mandatory for all Native children between the ages of 7 and 15 to attend school. Attendance at residential school was made compulsory. And so when you hear of stories of Native children being forcibly removed or abducted from their homes and parents, it was a result of Scott's innovation. In all, about 150,000 Aboriginal, Inuit, and Métis children were removed from their communities and forced to attend the schools. Harsh criticism has been leveled at Scott and the residential school system, as children who attended some of the more poorly maintained or administered schools lived in terrible conditions. Echoing Scott's desire to absorb Native people into the wider Canadian population, many residential and day schools strongly discouraged students from speaking their native language, and harsh punishments were administered. Corporal punishment was sometimes justified by the belief that it was the only way to civilize the Native children, and in the residential schools, punish runaways who might make the school responsible for injury or death while trying to return home. Many reports of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse in the residential schools have surfaced over the years. Because any kind of scandal coming out of the residential schools would have caused Indian Affairs, the churches, and the government of the day much embarrassment, incidents of abuse were often discounted or even covered up. The picture on the left is a boy by the name of Thomas Moore, who enrolled at the Regina Industrial School in 1903. And the picture on the right is Thomas Moore a few years later. They say a picture says 1,000 words. These pictures embody the stated goals of the residential school system. Their goal was to kill the Indian in the child. When you look at these pictures, what do you see? How does it make you feel? Peter Henderson Bryce was a medical doctor and an inspector for the Department of Indian Affairs. Beginning in 1907, Bryce collected data about the health and living conditions of students in the Indian residential school system, particularly the schools in Western Canada. He surveyed 35 schools and over 1,500 students. And what Bryce discovered was devastating. Let me cite one sad statistic. In 1907, Bryce reported an average mortality rate of between 14% and 24% at the residential schools. The children were dying primarily of tuberculosis. Think about that for a moment. 24% at some schools, which means 1 in 4 kids is dying at school. What would happen today if this were happening in any school in Canada? The news of Bryce's findings hit the front of at least 2 Canadian newspapers. The Times columnist headline read, "Indian Schools Dealing in Death. Startling rate of mortality is shown in report to the department." Bryce suggested improvements to the national policies regarding the care and education of the Native children. Simple things like fresh air, ventilated dormitories, and schoolrooms, because tuberculosis was spread through the air. In response, almost nothing was done by the government. Bryce's report was never released by the government, but was published by Bryce himself in 1922 under the title "The Story of a National Crime," being a record of the health conditions of Indians of Canada from 1904 to 1921. Justice Murray Sinclair was appointed the chair of Canada's Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission in June 2009. The commission's mandate was to inform all Canadians about what happened in Indian residential schools and document the accounts of survivors, families, communities, and anyone personally affected by the Indian residential schools experience. Senator Murray Sinclair offered a powerful response to Canadians who wonder why Native peoples don't just get over the trauma of residential schools. Anna Maria Tremonti asked the former Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission during a public forum in Ottawa on missing and murdered Indigenous women what he would say to people who pose that question. "My answer has always been, why can't you always remember this?" Sinclair said. "Because this is about memorializing those people who have been the victims of a great wrong. Why don't you tell the United States to get over 9/11? Why don't you tell this country to get over all the veterans who died in the Second World War instead of honoring them once a year? Why don't you tell your families to stop thinking about all your ancestors who died? Why don't you turn down and burn down all those headstones that you put up for your friends and relatives over the years? It's because it's important for us to remember. We learn from it. And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget, and we should never forget. Even once they have learned from it, because this is part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors. It's part of who we are as a nation, and this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people. According to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 3,201 children died in the residential school system. But the true number of children who died will likely never be known.